The water was calm that morning in the summer of 1882, calm in a way that felt staged, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. The divers would later say that the silence beneath the surface felt heavier than the weight of their copper helmets. They had descended many times before into cold, lightless depths, searching for lost anchors, damaged cables, and the remains of wrecks claimed by the Atlantic. But on that day, off a jagged stretch of coast, battered by centuries of storms, something in the water felt wrong long before they saw it. The men could not name the sensation, only that it followed them downward, tightening around their thoughts, as the daylight above faded into a dull, green haze. Their suits were the standard of the era, thick canvas reinforced with rubber, heavy boots bolted with lead, and brass helmets that turned each breath into a hollow echo. Air was pumped down through long hoses from the deck above, tethering the divers to the world of men and sunlight. Below them, the seabed sloped sharply, a submerged wall of stone plunging into darkness like the edge of a drowned continent. The divers moved slowly, methodically, aware that a single mistake could mean death. Yet even with all that caution, none of them were prepared for the feeling that the seafloor itself was watching. As they descended past 30 feet, then 40, the water grew colder, biting through layers of protection and settling into bone. Particles drifted in the water like falling ash, stirred by currents that moved with no apparent rhythm. One of the divers later described it as swimming through the remains of something ancient that had been ground into dust by time. Their boots touched down on rock, not sand, a sheer face that dropped away beneath them. They clung to iron lines driven into the stone by earlier crews, steadying themselves as they began their work. Minutes passed in near silence, broken only by the rasp of breath and the distant vibration of pumps from above. Then the water changed. Not temperature, not clarity, but pressure. A subtle shift that pressed inward from all sides. It was as if the sea had suddenly become aware of their presence and was adjusting itself around them. One diver turned, intending to signal his partner, and saw that the darkness behind them was no longer empty. At first it appeared as a shadow, deeper and more solid than the surrounding black. It moved slowly, with the deliberate certainty of something enormous conserving its strength. As it drew closer, the divers realized the shadow had texture, vast ridges and contours that suggested a living form. Their lamps, weak yellow halos in the water, brushed against a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature, if it could be called that, was not swimming in the way fish swim. It was passing beneath them, as a landmass might slide beneath drifting clouds. One diver tried to follow its movement, craning his neck within the helmet until pain shot down his spine. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The thing beneath them was so wide that his field of vision could not contain it. It stretched outward, left and right, vanishing into the dark on both sides. He later said it felt like standing on a cliff, while another cliff moved silently below, a living escarpment gliding through the depths. The water around them began to move, not violently, but with the slow displacement caused by something colossal. Their bodies swayed, lines pulling taut as currents shifted it without warning. Panic rose, sharp and immediate, but there was nowhere to run. The divers could only cling to the rock face and watch as the massive form continued its passage. No eyes were visible. No fins or limbs could be clearly identified. There was only the overwhelming impression of scale, a sense that this was not an animal passing through their world, but a world passing beneath them. In that moment, suspended between stone and abyss. One of the divers later claimed he felt an ancient awareness brush against his own. Not curiosity, not aggression, but indifference, as if the creature did not see them as living beings at all, but as insignificant debris clinging to the edge of its path. The realization was more terrifying than any attack could have been. To be beneath something so vast, so old, and to mean absolutely nothing to it. If you are listening to this now, take a moment and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Somewhere near the ocean, or far from it, in a place that feels safe from depths like these. The passage of the creature seemed endless. Seconds stretched into an eternity as the divers watched the darkness slide by beneath their boots. Their lamps revealed brief glimpses of what might have been ridged flesh or stone, hardened by centuries of growth. Some parts appeared scarred, as if the thing had brushed against mountains and reefs long before humans ever took to the sea. The thought that such a being could exist, unnoticed, moving silently through the deep, shook the foundations of everything they believed about the natural world. Then, just as gradually as it had come, the shadow began to fade. The water eased, currents settling back into familiar patterns. The oppressive pressure lifted, leaving behind an almost unbearable emptiness. The divers remained frozen, afraid that movement might draw the thing back. Only when the darkness beneath them returned to its original featureless void did they dare to signal each other. Their ascent was rushed and clumsy, fear overriding discipline. As they were hauled back toward the surface, the sea above seemed impossibly bright, unreal in its normality. On deck, the crew immediately noticed something was wrong. The divers emerged shaking, faces pale, eyes unfocused. They spoke over one another, struggling to describe what they had seen, or rather what had passed beneath them, wide as a cliff, longer than sight, moving with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Many dismissed their account as panic or exaggeration, the product of stress and low oxygen, yet the men themselves never wavered. They knew what they had experienced was real, and as the days passed, each of them began to recall other details, small sensations and fleeting impressions that suggested the encounter had been more than a chance crossing. It felt, they said, like the sea had briefly lifted a veil, revealing a fragment of something it usually kept hidden. If stories like this pull you deeper into the dark corners of forgotten history, consider subscribing now. There are many more encounters buried in old records, waiting to surface, and once you descend into them, it becomes very hard to look at the world the same way again. The days following the dive were swallowed by unease. The divers could not shake the feeling that they had brought something back with them. Not a physical object, but a presence that clung to the edges of their perception. The sea around the harbor seemed different now, darker even under sunlight, as if the water itself remembered. Villagers noticed the change before the men spoke of it. The fish vanished from their usual grounds, the gulls circled but never landed, and every night the waves broke with a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate, like breathing. The captain of the vessel, a man named Whitby, ordered the diving log sealed. He feared that any official report would bring ridicule or, worse, unwanted attention from maritime authorities. But word spread anyway. By the third day, fishermen from nearby towns came to the docks, eager to hear the tale directly from the men who had touched the abyss. The divers spoke reluctantly, their words trembling not from fear of mockery, but from the weight of memory. They described how the ocean had seemed to awaken around them, how the creature's movements stirred the very pressure of the world. One of them, the youngest, refused to speak at all. He sat by the harbor wall, staring at the horizon as if expecting it to move. It was then that the first strange event occurred. One night, just before dawn, a thunderous vibration rolled through the harbor. Ships rocked violently, though the sea was calm. Ropes snapped, and loose cargo rattled, as if struck by a tremor from below. Several men rushed to the edge of the pier, expecting to see waves or a storm swell, but the water was flat, eerily still, and in that silence, a faint glow pulsed far below, deep and slow, as if a heart were beating in the depths. The glow faded before anyone could react. Some dismissed it as phosphorescent plankton disturbed by currents, but the divers recognized it instantly. It had the same pulse, the same rhythm as the movement that had passed beneath them days earlier. Whitby decided to leave the harbor the following morning. He claimed it was a new salvage commission further down the coast, but the crew knew better. They could see the fear in his eyes. That morning, the tide receded lower than anyone could remember, exposing black stones, slick with seaweed and strange markings cut into their surfaces, markings that looked less like erosion and more like deliberate carving, symbols worn down by centuries of salt and silence. The older fishermen whispered old names, fragments of local legend, the wall beneath the sea, the moving cliff, and the one that turns the currents. As they sailed, fog swallowed the world. It rolled in without warning, thick and damp, muffling sound and swallowing color. The men could barely see the length of their own vessel. Compass needles spun in restless circles, and the air tasted metallic, like iron filings on the tongue. Whitby ordered the ship to anchor until visibility improved, but even the anchors seemed reluctant to sink. The chains rattled against unseen resistance as if dragging through something soft yet massive below. Hours passed. The fog did not lift. It was in that blindness that they heard it. A deep, resonant sound, not quite a roar, not quite a groan, but something between the two, carried through the water and into their bones. It seemed to come from every direction at once, vibrating through the hull and the men's teeth, echoing inside their skulls. The youngest diver, the one who had refused to speak, collapsed where he stood, clutching his head and screaming that it was calling to them. His words were incoherent, choked by terror, but one phrase cut through clearly. "It knows where we are." The noise ceased, leaving behind a silence so absolute that it felt heavier than the sound had been. When the fog finally began to thin, the men saw that the water around them had changed color. It was darker now, almost black, with a strange sheen that reflected light in shifting patterns, as though the sea had developed its own pulse. Whitby ordered the lines cut, and the ship turned toward open water, but before they could move, the sea beneath them began to rise, slowly, silently, lifting the vessel as though something beneath it were pushing upward. The men ran to the railings, peering down into the thick, ink-like depths, and saw movement, not waves, not bubbles, a vast, smooth swell forming directly beneath their hull. Then came the feeling again, that impossible pressure, the sensation of being observed not by eyes, but by something vast and ancient, something whose awareness existed beyond the limits of human comprehension. The creature, or whatever it was, passed beneath them once more, close enough that the sea seemed to bend around it. The ship tilted, wood groaning under strain. Men clung to the masts, shouting prayers into the wind. No one dared drop an anchor or sound the horn. They simply waited, suspended above a living shadow that stretched endlessly in every direction. When it was gone, the ocean flattened as if nothing had happened. The men were silent, each processing what they had felt. Some wept quietly. Others stared into the distance, hollow-eyed. They would not speak of it again for days, not until the next port, when one of the older crewmen began coughing up seawater, despite never having fallen overboard. The doctor called it coincidence. The others knew better. If this story is pulling you deeper, don't fight it. The depths always take what they're owed. Consider subscribing to this channel so you don't lose your way when we descend further, because the next part reveals what waited above the waves once the sea began to change. By the end of that same week, the coastline had changed. The water that had once glimmered blue-green in sunlight now lingered in shades of black and iron-gray, like oil spread thin across glass. Fishermen who dared to sail out returned empty-handed, their nets shredded, their hulls marked by deep, smooth gouges that looked less like damage and more like the imprint of something vast brushing against them. Word spread quickly along the villages of Devon and Cornwall. Something alive was moving through the depths, something older than the tides themselves. Whitby's crew had docked in secret, avoiding the main harbors. They spoke little to anyone, but the sea would not let them hide. Each man began to feel its pull. Dreams thick with soundless pressure, the sensation of sinking even while standing on dry land. The youngest diver stopped sleeping entirely. He claimed that when he closed his eyes, he saw not darkness, but movement, a vast, shifting mass that filled his vision. He said it wasn't chasing them. It was searching for them, methodically, as if remembering where they had been. At first the others laughed nervously, calling it guilt or madness, until one morning the harbor itself began to tremble. The fishermen thought it was an earthquake, but there was no rumble beneath the ground, only the sound of water retreating unnaturally fast, dragging boats with it. A smell rose from the exposed seabed, iron, salt, and something like decay. Then far out where the horizon had always been, a wall of mist began to rise, higher and higher, until it looked like the ocean itself had stood upright. Whitby knew that shape before the others did. He had seen it once before, not with his eyes but with his bones. The endless curve of something alive and moving beneath the surface. The men ran inland, but the tide came roaring back faster than any storm surge, flooding streets and dragging debris like the breath of a sleeping god inhaling once more. In the chaos, one of the crewmen was swept away. The water pulled him down silently, without struggle, and when the flood receded moments later, he was gone. The others stood in shock, unable to comprehend how something so vast could come and go without leaving a trace. That night, the survivors gathered in the remains of a boathouse. The air stank of brine, rot, and oil. Their lanterns flickered, though there was no wind. Whitby, trembling, unfolded a set of weathered charts he had kept hidden, maps drawn by earlier sailors who had explored that same coast decades before. On them were faint markings, half-erased symbols etched where the seafloor dropped abruptly. Beneath those markings, written in ink that had almost vanished, were the words, "Here the ground moves." The men realized that what they had encountered might not be a creature in the way men understand life. It could be something larger, something so deeply embedded in the planet's skin that it was part of it, a moving segment of the Earth's ancient anatomy. The diver who had refused to sleep whispered that perhaps it was not alive as they were, but something between being and place. A living landscape, older than the continents. 2 nights later, the youngest diver vanished. The others found his bed soaked in seawater, though the windows had been locked and the floor dry. The footprints leading from the bed to the door stopped halfway across the room. In their place were strange, circular impressions, as if something with immense weight had rested there momentarily. The men didn't speak of it again, but from that day onward, they never stayed within sight of the sea after dark. Still, the ocean would not be denied. It began to change the air itself. Gulls fell dead from the sky, their feathers soaked in an oily residue that burned the skin. Fishermen reported hearing low hums beneath their boats, rhythmic vibrations that made the hulls quiver, as though echoing a heartbeat from the deep. And then came the ships. On the morning of June 14th, a passing steamer was found adrift off the coast of Cornwall. Its crew was gone. Every door locked from the inside, every lamp shattered. In the captain's log, one final entry read, "The sea beneath us is breathing." Maritime investigators dismissed it as hysteria, a symptom of long hours at sea and mechanical noise. But Whitby and his men knew the truth. They could feel the same pulse even standing on the pier. Each night, the tide came in heavier, as though dragged by something unseen. The docks creaked, ropes snapped, and distant booms echoed from beneath the waves. Then one morning, an entire stretch of the shoreline simply collapsed. Locals who went to see it found a sheer drop where sand and rock had once been. An underwater chasm, black and silent, its edges glistening as if polished. The air above it shimmered faintly, and when stones were thrown in, no splash came. Only the soft, muffled sound of impact, followed by a long, low rumble that faded into nothing. It was around this time that the press began to take notice. Newspapers called it the Devon phenomenon. Reporters spoke of seismic activity, volcanic gas, or strange magnetic fields affecting local wildlife. None dared mention what the divers had claimed, though rumors spread quietly through taverns and harbors. Whispers of a moving shape beneath the English Channel, seen by night watchmen, glowing faintly as it passed. Whitby's remaining men scattered inland, but wherever they went, the same dreams followed. One of them, an older diver named Hargreaves, claimed that in his sleep he saw the creature rise to the surface, not fully, but enough to reveal a surface so vast it reflected the moon like polished obsidian. He said it looked less like skin and more like stone, slick with centuries of tide. When he awoke, his hands were wet with seawater, and his boots filled with sand. The madness deepened. The boundaries between memory and hallucination blurred until none of them could be sure what was real. Yet one night, all uncertainty vanished. A ship from France reported passing near the same coordinates where Whitby's team had first descended. The crew said the water there seemed unnaturally heavy, pulling at the vessel as though the ocean itself resisted their movement. Then they saw it, a rise in the surface, circular and immense, stretching for what seemed like miles. It lifted the ship slightly, like a tide coming from below rather than the horizon, and as it moved, the sea around it glowed faintly blue-green, pulsing in time with some deep rhythm beneath. The report was buried, dismissed as delirium, but within weeks, coastal settlements began to experience strange phenomena. Compasses spinning aimlessly, the ground vibrating with low, inaudible frequencies, and the sea refusing to calm even in perfect weather. Whitby wrote one final entry in his personal log before disappearing entirely. "The abyss has remembered us." And now, the land itself's beginning to listen. For those who listen to this story, If you feel the air around you shift or hear a low hum in the silence, remember. Some things never left the depths. They only waited for us to look down first. Subscribe now, before we resurface, because what emerged from the sea next would prove that some awakenings can't be undone. By late summer of 1892, the coastline had become a place of fear. Villages emptied overnight, fishing boats rotted at their moorings, and the sound of bells from deserted churches rang out over the blackened tide like a warning no one was left to heed. The few who remained described the sea as a living thing, restless, muttering, shifting its color with the moods of a dying world. Some swore that at certain hours just before dawn, the horizon itself curved upward, as if the sea were swelling against the sky, and sometimes, in the dead of night, low vibrations rolled across the land, so deep and sustained that the very windows trembled. Whitby's ship was found drifting 20 miles from the coast, its sails shredded, its hull covered in barnacles that should have taken decades to grow. There was no crew, no blood, no sign of struggle, only the logbook, sealed in oilcloth and wedged beneath the captain's cot. The final pages were written in a shaking hand. They spoke of a pattern, a rhythm in the sea that matched no tide chart known to man. It pulsed in cycles, 3 days of silence, 1 of movement, and each time it moved, something deep below seemed to awaken a little more. The last entry read, "We are not floating above the ocean. We are walking on its skin." Scholars would later call it madness. Maritime historians dismissed it as myth. But the reports that followed in the months ahead were harder to ignore. Telegraph cables laid across the channel began to fail. Divers sent to inspect them returned half dead from panic, claiming that something enormous moved beneath the lines, something that disturbed the currents themselves. Their descriptions matched what Whitby's crew had seen. Not a creature with form, but a presence with mass, something wide as a cliff and slow as the turning of the world. The British Admiralty silenced the reports, citing mechanical disturbances. Yet in private correspondence, one officer admitted that during inspection voyages, compasses refused to settle and soundings revealed impossible depths, trenches that had never existed before. And on moonless nights, faint lights were seen moving under the surface, too large, too synchronized to be schools of fish. By autumn, storms began to hit without warning. Waves taller than ships struck from calm seas, carrying within them strange debris. Fragments of stone, carved with symbols no geologist could explain. Entire stretches of beach were scoured clean, leaving behind black sand that shimmered in unnatural patterns. And in one fishing hamlet, a survivor told of seeing the water part just beyond the shore. He said the sea folded open like fabric, revealing not darkness but movement. Slow, deliberate, vast beyond comprehension. The man went blind 3 days later, his eyes clouded with a milky film. Scientists sent from London took samples of the black sand, only to find it reacted to light, dimming and brightening in rhythm with an unseen pulse. One researcher described it as the sea breathing through stone. Another never returned, after venturing alone to the coast at night, leaving behind only his notebook, filled with sketches of shapes that curved like spines of mountains and notes scrawled in desperation. "It's not under us. We're inside it." Then came the night the stars disappeared. It began quietly, with the sea flattening to glass, the air thickening until sound itself seemed swallowed. The tide stopped moving, not receded, not advanced, stopped. Witnesses said the moonlight reflected off the ocean in a perfect circle, unbroken by waves. Then slowly, the reflection began to ripple, not from wind, but from something rising beneath. The horizon swelled upward, bending unnaturally, until the line between sea and sky blurred, and from that impossible curve came light, a faint, greenish glow that pulsed with the rhythm of a slow, ancient heart. What surfaced was not a creature as men understood the term. There were no eyes, no limbs, no mouth, only endless texture, ridged surfaces like mountains shifting under flesh, valleys glowing faintly with the bioluminescent hue of a dying world. The sea around it boiled, but not from heat, from pressure, from displacement so vast that the air itself began to hum. Those who saw it said it was not rising out of the sea. It was the sea. Every current, every tide, every whisper of motion for millennia had been its breath, its pulse, its dream, and now it was awake. The sky fractured with lightning that had no thunder. Winds reversed direction. The sea stood still, like glass over a lung that no longer knew whether to exhale or drown. Then, from the depths below the creature's vast form, came sound, low, sustained, resonant. It traveled through stone and bone alike. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads, blood leaking from their ears. Others ran inland, but the ground shook beneath them as though the earth itself shared the same heartbeat. No one knows how long it lasted. Time seemed to distort, bending around the sound until all that existed was vibration. The creature began to move again, slowly turning, the glow beneath its surface dimming as it sank back into the black. When the first light of dawn broke, it was gone, and the ocean lay silent once more, as if nothing had ever happened, but something had changed. The sea no longer smelled the same. It no longer sounded the same. Mariners who sailed those waters afterward reported strange stillness, as though the water resisted their passage. Instruments failed. Soundings came back impossible. Depths that extended beyond the limits of their lines. And sometimes, when fog rolled low and the air went still, those who listened closely could hear it again. That low, patient pulse, far beneath the waves, steady as eternity. Years later, the survivors of Whitby's crew were found scattered across the country, each living in isolation, far from the sea. One was discovered in a church attic, having covered every wall with sketches of swirling currents and spiraling shapes. Another lived in the moors, building small cairns of stone that mirrored the markings once seen on the seafloor. None of them ever spoke of the sea again, but they all died the same way. With their eyes open, faces turned toward the sound of distant waves. Historians eventually buried the accounts under the label of maritime myth. Yet even now, the waters off that coast remain uncharted. Instruments fail, divers vanish, and fishermen still speak of nights when the sea seems to lift slightly, breathing once more. And maybe, just maybe, what rose in 1882 never truly returned to sleep. It only turned over in its endless dream, waiting for the next sound, the next disturbance, the next moment when human curiosity dares to dive too deep again. So if you've stayed with me through this descent, through the salt, the darkness, and the pulse of what lies beneath, remember, some truths are not meant to surface. But if you crave more of what hides in the deep, like this video, subscribe and leave your mark in the comments below. Tell me, would you dive again, knowing what waits under the waves? Because in stories like this, the sea always remembers, and sooner or later it comes back for those who listened.